Ed's already covered. But new fire investigators in Texas usually begin their training when they begin attending their basic arson investigator certification school. And that is sponsored by the Texas Commission on Fire Protection. Now, to my knowledge, prior to 1992, the agency or the campus, whoever was conducting the school, would develop a curriculum, including lesson plans, and they would submit them to the State Fire Commission for approval. And once it was approved, then that school or that agency would put on the school. Once the students complete that school, they're eligible to take the state exam. And that state exam is administered by the Texas Commission on Fire Protection. Once they pass that exam, then they are certified by the state of Texas as an arson investigator. Now, arson investigators who investigate fires involving crimes have to also be certified Texas peace officers. So there's two certifications that these arson investigators have to hold before they can conduct fire investigations and render opinions and testify in court. And that's through the Texas Commission on Fire Protection and through TCLAS. The Texas Commission on Fire Protection requires 20 hours of continuing education annually. And these courses are supposed to be fire-related courses, some type of fire-related courses. TCLAS requires, or the peace officer end of it, requires the same thing, 40 hours every 2 years. So to my knowledge, that's the only continuing education that's required by the two certifications that investigators hold. After students become both certified peace officers and arson investigators, then normally whatever agency they're working for, they'll be assigned to a more experienced investigator and work under that investigator for a length of time before they are normally allowed to make a determination as to origin cause of fires. And that length of time is usually decided on by their supervisor or agency. One of the problems that I've seen is that if a new investigator is assigned to a more experienced investigator, and that individual has not had the recent updates or attended the schools or seminars where these recent updates and whatnot have been discussed and covered, then that new investigator is not getting the material either. And it can be a problem where a cycle develops. But I have seen a great improvement in the training in our field of fire investigation over the years.
Mr. Wood, did you have any contact with materials in the Whittingham case?
I did.
Have you had an opportunity to go through those materials and, along with some other people, evaluate them?
Yes, sir.
Who are the other people that you shared that process with?
One was Dave Ryder, who is an electrical engineer. Another is a fire investigator, Tommy Singh. Another investigator by the name of Corey Martin. These are individuals that I know that are in the fire investigative field, who I trust. And we met one time together, and other than that, we individually looked over the material and had discussions over the phone and through emails. The possibility did exist at one point in time that we may conduct a review, but that never materialized.
Did you feel like you became familiar enough with the case to form any opinions about it?
I've never formed an opinion on a fire as to origin cause without physically being there and looking at the scene. I have done peer reviews where I've discussed certain aspects of an investigation, like we did in this case, but I've never actually formed an opinion without physically being there.
Given the number of years of experience as a fire investigator that you have had, I assume that you would have been around and at least somewhat familiar with the standard of practice as it existed back in 1991 for investigation?
Yes, sir.
And we've heard endlessly that there wasn't a standard of practice, at least a uniform written one, but that some areas did have some sort of process or systematic approach that they would have. What is your opinion on that as far as 1991?
My opinion is that for a long time prior to, excuse me, prior to 1992 when 921 first came out, my opinion is that fire investigators have been using this scientific method for many, many years. It wasn't called that, it wasn't labeled that, but as I've read Fire Marshal Vasquez's report and the other reports, if you were to line them up side by side with what 921 suggests now, the step-by-step procedures, I think that's what occurred at that investigation.
Well, there would certainly be differences in terms of some individual things that do or do not suggest arson. You would agree with that?
Oh, yes, definitely. Yes.
But in terms of the process or the systematic approach or the scientific method, whichever one, you're saying that there was such a method in this case?
Yes.
Okay. And was it a method, as far as you could see, that was consistent with the standard of practice to the extent that it existed in 1991?
To what I was exposed to, yes, sir.
And did you see anything that would cause you to believe that it was so far outside of the norm for that period of time that it was negligent?
Not negligent, no.
I assume you agree that science did move on, that there are a number of specific things that were evaluated in there that we probably wouldn't do today.
Without question.
Did you think that that alone makes what he did useless?
No, sir.
What did you conclude?
I think there were indicators there, fire indicators, that are still looked at as proof of a possible incendiary fire.
Specifically, what are those?
The one thing that I haven't heard discussed today is the construction of the flooring of that bedroom. And to my knowledge, from what I can ascertain, without being there, just reading reports and whatnot, there was 5 layers of materials on that floor. And I think that's an important factor that needs to be considered in interpreting the fire damage, the fire patterns, the irregular shape patterns there. And I'm not 100% sure that flashover even occurred in that room.
Why does the thickness and the number of layers there matter to suggest that there was arson?
Well, the materials that I have been made or told that was present there are materials that the damage was significant. It went through all the way to the 5th layer to the oak floor, wood flooring. And I'm not sure, without flashover occurring, if that damage would be there without the presence of an igniter liquid.
So I'm going to break this down into my kind of language. Are you suggesting that there was something poured on the floor and burned because of the depth of the burning?
Partially, yes. Possible. Another thing I haven't heard talked about is that when fire investigators secure debris samples for pre-analysis, they expect a negative return because they're volatile liquids. They evaporate, they burn away. To my understanding, the one sample that came back positive was under the threshold, the aluminum threshold, that was somewhat protected by that aluminum threshold.
Which would
Retain the liquid.
limit from burning on?
Yes, sir, to some degree.
Okay. So is it significant to you that it came back negative for the middle of the room? Does that automatically tell you that it couldn't be an arson?
No, sir, not at all.
And I guess what I'm hearing is you tend to find negatives even in known arsons,
That's correct.
where you have other independent verifications that a particular fire was an arson.
Yes.
Okay.
So the depth of burning through the floor after the 5th layer suggests to you possible accelerant being used?
The possibility, yes, sir. Especially if flashover did not occur.
And you feel that there was no flashover, there is no
I'm
proof
not
to
sure.
suggest that.
I was talking with Dr. Byer before he left, and I've been peer reviewing this with other investigators, and I'm not sure if you can have full room involvement without flashover, but I'm believing that you can.
So the floor construction and the chemical testing that was positive at the threshold, are those for you the two most compelling indicators that are left in the original investigation documents?
Well, before I answer that, one of the things that is so prominent to me about fire investigations is a lot of the evidence is circumstantial. We hardly ever have direct evidence. So the totality of the evidence is so very important, including witness accounts. Now, when witness accounts are given, sure, an attempt should be made to corroborate those accounts and see if they are accurate and truthful. But the totality of the evidence is what the majority of, a lot of our calls are made on, as opposed to one or two indicators.
And does that go back to the slide that Mr. Salazar showed us, that ultimately a fire investigator has to take all of the data and come to a conclusion?
Yes, it is. The other thing that I'd like to have y'all consider is written transcriptions of testimony can be misleading. Anybody that's testified a few times or more knows that. And it seems like the testimony was relied upon pretty heavily as to what occurred out there. But from past experience, I can tell you that transcribed testimony from witnesses on the stand don't always portray what actually happens out at the scene. Now, it sure would have been nice for the reports to have been more complete. We're never going to know what's in his mind.
Do you conduct reviews of investigations of fire investigators in your office?
Yes,
And when you do that, I assume you read their reports?
yes,
Do you also talk to them?
yes.
Is it important to talk to them?
You give them a chance to answer questions, yes.
Is there some disadvantage to not talking to them?
I would certainly think so, yes, sir.
Would you think that that would be a fair way to evaluate someone's work, assuming that they are available?
Yes.
Does that trouble you about this particular scenario, about how the investigation is being handled and looked at and done? Are there ways in which this has been conducted that you could offer constructive advice on how, from the point of view of someone who could be investigated in the future, you would want to see it done?
Yes, sir.
I'd love to hear it.
Well, it's so hard to determine what the term standard of care was back then, and by what agency and by what individual investigator. We're never going to know exactly what that standard of care, if you will, was. But like I said, the reports, if the reports were more complete, then we would have had a better idea. But there are indicators there. There are indicators that can't be explained away. A lot of times the investigators that are conducting those investigations are speaking for the victims. Sometimes, in this case, they can't tell you anything. So all the investigator has is the scene. And the old adage that fire tells a story, I don't know how many times I've taught that in my classes, but it's true, it's accurate.
Is it sort of a metaphor?
Yes, sir.
Do we mean that literally?
Well, it does tell a story to me. If it's interpreted correctly, it tells you a story of the history of that fire. I don't know how else to say it.
When you say that there are indicators that can't be explained away, do you mean that there are no other alternative explanations for the things that were documented in the investigator's report?
I mean, there are indicators that could be, that could go both ways. Could have been
Okay.
caused by an incendiary fire and could have been caused by other than incendiary.
I wanted to clarify that because when you say they can't be explained away, you don't mean that the conclusion should be arson. Okay. It means that it's possible that it's arson.
That's correct.
I think you also.
But
sorry.
let me complete what you say. But you are not sure there was a flashover.
I
And
am
this
not.
is why you're concluding that those indicators then imply arson.
I'm sorry, could you repeat?
Since there was no flashover, then obviously those indicators are more consistent with an arson.
I believe so, yes, sir.
I'm sorry, Sarah.
That's okay. I had one more question. You were talking about how the training has improved dramatically over the years, and I think everyone's pleased about that and not surprised. It happens in every discipline, not just in fire science, fire investigation. Are there cases now, as a very seasoned and experienced fire investigator with all of the scientific knowledge that we have today, are there cases where you provide opinions today that are very different from maybe opinions you may have provided back in the early 1990s?
Me personally,
Yes, you personally.
I can think of one right now where I would have changed my call based on the changes in fire science. I've been lucky to be exposed to some good training, and although I will point out this, and this is one area that y'all may be helpful in, is usually when budgets are cut in a department, the training division is the first one to get the axe. And even with the federal agencies, I was on a task force with ATF, and one of the reasons I went there was to try to obtain training, and they get their training division got the axe. So, and the mandatory continued education I talked to you about, I would like to see it specified as to what type of training that mandatory training should consist of. And not
Currently,
leave it up-
the investigator chooses at this point what, he just has to have a certain number of hours?
Well, the fire commission has to approve it, but I'm not sure, and there's some great people over there that have done some great work, so I don't want to talk bad about them, but I think it needs to be specified, especially, there are classes out there currently that talk about the changes in fire science that have taken place, but not enough, not near enough.
And so when you suggest that there ought to be specific classes, maybe those classes ought to specifically involve advances in science,
Yes, sir?
rather than general techniques or other areas.
Yes, and agencies aren't going to pay for it. My agency won't pay for it.
In the one case that you've identified over all of those years, where you say you would provide a different opinion, as a fire investigator, what's your obligation in terms of rectifying that opinion? What do you do?
I've never been made of an obligation. I've never been made aware of any such obligation other than a moral obligation. There's nothing that I know of, any SOP or, written directive or anything like that. Is that it?
That's what we've been hearing. Other questions? Thank you very much.
Sir.
Mr. Gahan, if you have some other comment, we can give you about 5 minutes.
Sure, because I'm running out of time.
Here you are. You've been very patient.
I addressed the issue of significance of ignitable liquids at the door threshold during my presentation this morning. But some comments have been made here this afternoon about floor damage and irregular burns and things like that, and why that's significant. This is Kirk's 6th edition. That's the current edition of my book. And there's a photograph, figure 9.20, and I think almost the same picture, if not the same picture, as in the two most recent issues of 921. And it's pictures taken of, or a picture taken of a fire test that I helped conduct. And it shows extensive, irregular, deep burning of the composite floor in this, this turns out to be a mobile home. And the issue is, how do I get deep burning? Well, I got to keep something burning long enough on floor to make that happen. And in all the tests I've done with ignitable liquids of all kinds, pouring it on floors of all kinds, what happens is ignitable liquids burn away to the point, not necessarily to the point where they're undetectable chemically, but they are no longer contributing to the fire. And that makes it very difficult, if not impossible, for the fire to progress downward into the floor. Whereas if I have extensive hot smoke layer, has been described here by several witnesses, that I can keep a lot of radiant heat on the floor for prolonged periods of time and create irregular deep burns, especially as the floor coverings themselves start to decompose and burn and char and melt and do whatever else, as well as any intermediate target materials like clothing, toys, and things like that. So that all contributes to the possibility. There's also a couple of pictures in here, see if I can find it real fast, the aftermath of a fire test. This is figure 7.4A and B, and this was a fire test conducted by excuse me, a colleague of mine, Jamie Novak in Minnesota, and it shows extensive, deep, irregular burning of not only the floor but the entire room without any ignitable liquids. And so,
Does 921 give a fire investigator room to interpret that either way?
yes, in fact, when 921, currently at least, I don't know how far back it goes, but when it discusses irregular burns on floors, it specifically cautions investigators not to interpret pool or pour or irregular burns as being the result of ignitable liquids unless there's specifically a positive lab test to go with it.
So when Mr. Wood says you can have a specific burn and a positive test, you're limiting that only to the same burn pattern?
Yes, it has to be associated with the burn damage you see.
And is that what 921 are actually limited to?
Yes,
Doesn't it actually give the fire investigator discretion to interpret that as a burn from an incendiary source?
only to the extent where there is isolated burns of well-defined origin, limited in extent, not a complete area involved in fire damage.
Isn't this the kind of detail that is not unusual for, in a courtroom, you to be on one side testifying about and somebody on the other side testifying in a different manner, and the judge has admitted evidence from both sides?
Yes, the issue is I have the scientific proof to back me up because I've done the tests,
Certainly,
published them.
that's certainly your version, but at least in the court system hasn't deemed the DeHaan book as the only testimony admissible in evidence, has it?
Not to my knowledge, no.
So there certainly is a range of professional testimony that can come into court on these various subjects.
Yes,
We're not dealing with absolutes, are we?
in most cases, no, we're not.
That's all I'm about.
Okay.
And let me understand you before you. I have that book and I've read that particular area there. It was my understanding that when you do in fact have deep burns, it is much more consistent with flashovers. And in fact, deep burns rarely occur with accelerants. Do I understand that correctly?
That's correct, because some of the other pictures in the book are fire tests where we've actually put ignitable liquids on surfaces, burned them, and showed the essential absence of deep burning. That's absolutely correct.
So in fact, understanding what was written in the book, am I correct in saying that there is in fact proof of flashover if there is a deep burn?
That's correct.
And furthermore,
That's one of the criteria.
one of the
Yes.
criteria. And that furthermore, these were all controlled burns, where there was clear observation and where we clearly knew that there were no accelerants present. Am I correct?
That's correct.
And that in fact, there were experiments done to show that with accelerants, there were no deep burns in most cases.
That's correct.
Thank you.
I think we heard Mr. Salazar say that it was his opinion that the original investigation did in fact follow the standard of 921, and I think maybe Mr. Wood gave that opinion as well. Is that your opinion?
Well, it followed, my reaction was it followed the steps, but not the logical consequences, not the analysis that needs to be carried out. And I made the mention this morning that if I have could have and could have, it doesn't mean that's the answer. It means just that. Those are possibilities, or even probabilities. But when you testify in court that this was an incendiary fire caused by ignitable liquids, it's got to be more than probabilities.
And did you see anything in the PowerPoint presentation that we all watched that changed your opinion, that you would now go from an undetermined to an arson?
No, it'd still be an undetermined fire, following the precepts of 921, or my own text.
The photograph of the ceiling that Mr. Salazar showed us, is that consistent with the flashover and the deep burn on the floor? Is that the condition of the ceiling?
Yes, in fact, I'm glad you mentioned that because it indicates very high energy hot smoke layer and causing drop down. There was an element mentioned made that there wasn't anything to fall on the floor because the ceiling was still intact. Well, that one picture that we showed looked like there was something falling off the floor, off the ceiling. It could have created localized burns on the floor. But yes, that's one of the other indicators. High temperatures at the ceiling, fairly uniform damage to the walls, all the way down to the floor, and then irregular burning. And what Mr. Wood was alluding to was, yes, we once thought it was radiant heat only, and then as we watched more and more fire tests and we understood the dynamics, what happens in flashover, it becomes an extremely turbulent fire, which is now driven by the ventilation more than anything else, because everything in the room is on fire that can burn is burning. And now the ventilation point is one of the controlling factors of how intense the fire is. And so breaking windows, open doors, all drive the fire in very irregular and often, in some cases, unpredictable means. And so you have to look at the ventilation points and realize that, gee, a lot of the damage to that bedroom was around the windows and doors, and in some cases, connecting them. That's all part of that extremely turbulent post-fire environment. Post-flashover environment.
There may be a noise associated with that, a roar or sound, and so
Yes.
the witnesses heard.
Yes, we've noticed that there is a transition, and when it becomes extremely turbulent, you hear this whoa, 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 as the air tries to move in and out at the same time. So yes, that from the outside, a witness could hear a transition. And in some cases, that's their only warning that there's something burning in the house, is that transition. Or as windows fail, they hear the crash of glass, look over, and there's flames gouting out of the now open window, or broken window, I should say.
Thank you very much. Mr. Wood, I'll give you about
I'd
5
like to
minutes.
ask Dr. DeHaan a question, if possible. I'd like to get your opinion of I'm not sure what the proper term for the paper that was shown on the ceiling, and I don't think there was any sheetrock or anything on the outer surface. I think that paper was the outermost surface. So to me, if that hot layer is up there, I mean, where's the hottest temperature going to be? It's going to be up against the ceiling. Why did that paper survive up there?
Well, it looked like it survived. Once again, like you, I share the limitation. I didn't see the scene, so all we have is pictures. But if I have paper secured to a flat surface, it's going to be pretty resistant to combustion. Once it starts to bubble or peel away from that surface, then it becomes thermally thin, reaches very high temperatures, and burns off. And so you end up with these irregular patches. And in an old structure like that, I wouldn't be surprised if the ceiling itself was wood at one time, behind all those
The
layers.
ceiling was wood, but did you see how much of the paper survived?
Yeah, and that may well have occurred as the fire actually starts to be suppressed, and you end up with the painted paper sagging off the ceiling and things like that. But yes, that's a good point. Just for the same reason the paper on gypsum wallboard doesn't burn until it starts to peel away, unless there's extremely intense radiant heat against it.
And would an investigator, either one of you there, again, you're working with pictures, would an investigator perhaps have an opportunity to see more detail that could assist him in trying to bridge these two opinions?
Yes, it's always better to see the scene firsthand if you can.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you all.
Mr. Salazar, we can give you about 10 minutes to finish if you'd like.
You've already talked about how these standards have changed. and how the State Fire Marshal's Office has tried to make sure that its investigators are educated in these changing standards. Can you think of any instance where the Fire Marshal's Office has gone back, and I'm not talking about the William test at all, gone back and reevaluated the previous investigations in light of these advancements that you guys have observed and have incorporated into your investigation?
Well, it's very difficult. I think it's many people that pointed out, and I think from what we've heard, the whole process works. It's a cumulative situation. So to go back and say, well, you know, you used crazed glass just as an example. You can say you use crazed glass as the end all to beat all. You're not going to find it. You know, it's very difficult. It's a cumulative effort. What we have seen are situations where one of our deputies is going to be deposed. And during the, I guess, woodshedding, where we're talking and preparing the deposition or reviewing the reports, they've made comments or made something in the report that's just not valid. They can't support it. And that has been brought to their attention for correction. But the way the process works, and I guess maybe it is a shortcoming, I don't know. We wouldn't know, once our reports are turned over in a criminal situation, what the district attorney's office does and runs with at that point in time, it's not our call, it's their call. Once a prosecution is completed, we're pretty much out of the picture. That we're not aware, as in this particular case, we're not aware or advised of any appellate proceedings that are going on, and we're not called upon to testify anymore. That there is no more testimony at that point in time, as far as we're concerned. So obviously, I mean, and I leave it to Mr. Maldonado, if we were made aware of a situation where one of our deputies had made a report that clearly, in the cumulative effect and its opinion, conclusion, was wrong, I mean, obviously we would bring it to the attention of whatever officials were necessary at that particular point in time.
When we began this process, long before I got on this commission, I know that you have been in it all the way from, were you involved from the beginning?
Well, yes, I had initial conversations with Mr. Bassett,
Okay.
and that appeared before the committee.
So you've had the opportunity to see a commission that has evolved. This was a commission that was created in 2005. It wasn't funded until 2007. Our first staff member was probably a year after that, and only